Columbus executives met to talk about the possibility of starting a new school. We had one thing in common. None of us had any idea what we were doing. We had no experience. We didn't even have a decent plan to get the job done. But we did agree on 4 points. One, we intended to create a competitive alternate to break the monopoly created by 2 mature independent schools, Columbus Academy and Columbus School for Girls. 2, the new school would be co-ed in contrast to the single-sex institutions that dominated the field at that time. 3, because our competition was on the east side of town, the school needed to be located in the northwest quadrant of the community. 4, the school would be independent, which means no affiliation with any particular religious organization. Well, with our lack of experience, we made every mistake in the book. If we had been given, I've often said, if I'd had a crystal ball in that meeting to show what would happen next, it probably never would have gone to another meeting. It seems a miracle that Wellington has been successful today in spite of the errors made by its founders. Our speaker today is the 4th head of Wellington School. He's a native of New Jersey. He graduated from Dwight Englewood School before entering Princeton to earn an AB degree in classics. His master's degree is from Harvard School of Education. Just a decade ago, he came to Wellington from Oregon Episcopal School in Portland. Before that, he was upper school head at Dwight Englewood, his alma mater. He has many talents, and above all, he is an innovator. The program that he is about to describe is indeed revolutionary. To the best of our knowledge, it has never been applied before at any academic institution. Please give a warm welcome to Rob Brisk.
When I met Ken, he said that the founders of the school were arrogant enough to think they could start a school, but not so arrogant as to think they could run one. So I'm delighted because that gave me a job. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I have enormous respect for Rotary and all of the wonderful programs that you do. At Wellington, we're proud to contribute to the overall pre-K through 12th grade educational environment of Columbus. And I want to share with you today some of our cutting-edge thinking about new educational directions, and especially about new ways of measuring success of schools. 2 weeks ago at lunch with a friend of mine who's a professor at Kenyon, he wanted to talk about his teaching, and he made a statement and then posed a question. His statement was that students, many coming from fine secondary schools, hardworking and eager students, seemed to be comfortable only when they were very guided. That is, when the professor told them exactly what to do and how to do it. If the questions that were asked were open-ended, the students would be flummoxed. They'd have difficulty trying to figure out what to do, and they were often uncomfortable and very often stuck. His question was, what were secondary schools doing that made students so timid in their problem solving? And how were secondary schools strengthening student independence and resilience? I've heard this same question not only from educators, but also from business people, lawyers, and doctors, all of the people who are hiring the next generation of folks in those areas. In my 37 years as an educator, I've heard thousands of questions. There is one question asked every day, millions of times, and it is almost always answered badly. Every day, 55 million Americans go to school, and when they come home, the majority of them are asked by a loving parent, "How was school today?" Have any of you ever asked that question? Before my 2 boys went to college, I estimate that I asked that question 5,096 times, and always with terrible responses. And in fact, I've summarized those for you. I estimate 84% unintelligible grunt, and that was when they were in a good mood, with a minuscule 0.5% of the time would I receive a real answer. So why do we keep asking that question over and over again, knowing that there's little likelihood that we're going to get any kind of satisfactory response? Well, I'd like you to meet my grandnephew. Isn't he adorable? Kelly Brisk. 5 minutes with Kelly or any other 2-year-old will teach you everything you need to know about love of learning. Kelly is an artist, an explorer, a disruptor, and while he's doing those things, he's learning to speak English, to walk straight, and to keep his pants on. He is, as is every 2-year-old, the embodiment of love of learning. And when he goes off to school, his parents for 15 years are going to be disappointed in his answers, but they're going to continue to ask, how was school today, every day? Because they want to be sure that Kelly's school nurtures the love of learning they've seen in him every day of his life. Unfortunately, schools don't have much time for the love of learning, and we should have seen it coming. It was in 1983 when the National Commission on Excellence in Education published its landmark report, A Nation at Risk. This report said terrible things about the American educational system. My favorite terrible thing was, quote, if a hostile power had tried to impose upon America its mediocre system of education, we would have considered it an act of war, unquote. But A Nation at Risk also was a document about love of learning, and one of the most important recommendations that in that report was that we must steer away from minimum competency standardized testing, and instead that we work to focus every mind on its fullest potential. The problem with standardized testing is twofold. First, minimum competency testing sets the goal at just that, minimum competency. It creates low expectations. How many of you have described a valued employee as being minimally competent? Second, high-stakes standardized testing requires school systems and teachers to standardize student learning. If there's only one outcome required, that students give a standard answer to a standard question, we program out of our students the ability and inclination to think in diverse ways. Trained in this way, students become adept at answering a question they recognize in a reliable way. But a question that they don't recognize throws too many of them completely. In life, unrecognizable, tricky, open-ended questions emerge all the time. So what did we do with this recommendation from A Nation at Risk, that we avoid minimum competency testing and embrace the fullest potential of all students? We ignored it entirely, and instead we ran into the embrace of high-stakes testing as the only measure acceptable for determining success of schools, and the results have been pretty clear. Since 1983, and I'm going to show you just a few headlines from various newspapers, our standardized testing scores have shown little improvement. We've seen cheating scandals. We've seen parental protests and opt-outs. We've seen huge expenditures of money in high-stakes standardized testing. And we've seen extraordinary legislative backflips as our elected officials have tried to mitigate unintended consequences of previous legislation. Recently, when an official of the state of Ohio was asked why we embrace standardized testing instead of even considering love of learning, he had the following response: how important can love of learning be if we can't measure it? Well, we can and we do measure it. Before you, perhaps, are 9,000 data points from Wellington's 2015-16 school year, measuring student engagement for every student in every grade, from grades 5 through 12. And I want to explain a little bit about how we do this. First, when we talk about love of learning, what we are trying to measure is what we call student engagement. And for those of you who have any trouble seeing that screen, I'm going to try and do this without blinding anyone, because I have a laser pointer, and you know how dangerous those can be. Duck, everyone. You can see right here is another setting of what you're about to see. So if that's more convenient, feel free to look there. So we say that student engagement happens when there are two phenomena that happen at the same time. So, first, in order for students to be truly engaged, they must find their work significantly challenging. And second, while they're finding the work challenging, they should love it. And love it is just a little bit off the corner. But you can see it over there. Students who are challenged and love it are likely to do their best work, and they're going to be impelled to do more once they're done. Students, and we call that we call those students engaged. If a student is challenged but hates it, we refer to that phenomenon as the grind. The student may learn quite a bit, but the student may never want to touch that subject again. If a student is unchallenged and hates it, we refer to that as bored. And if a student is unchallenged and loves it, we had a harder time finding the right word for that. We call that entertained. You know, it's a lovely place to be. You're not asked to do very much. So I want to do something now. I want you all to think back to the time you were in high school, and for President Jack, that's going to take some doing. I want you to think about a class that you took that was memorable, either good or bad. Have you got one? Are you all back in high school now? Okay. Now, where would you put that class on this grid? Would you have any trouble placing it on the grid? I'm seeing a bunch of you go, no trouble at all. Okay. When I think of, and it's easy for me, and not quite as far back as President Jack, but 40 years ago in high school, I remember that my senior Latin class tested me to the utmost, and I loved it. At the same time, in the same year, my economics class, not so much. And it's no surprise that I became a classics major in college, and that I took one economics class and I failed the midterm. Monica, don't tell our children that, please. Now, if I can remember those things 40 years hence, we believe that students who are actually taking the classes can be asked to give us critical analysis of the experiences that they're having, because, in fact, they are the experts. They're the experts on whether they feel challenged and whether they love it. So what we did was we asked students 3 times a year to take a list of classes and through a digitized process to place them on a grid, and we get searchable data that leads us to all sorts of conclusions. So we can look at classes, and here you see 2 classes, same students, and in slightly different subjects. And I'm going to tell you what it is because we're a little bit off the side there. Teacher 1 has the vast majority of the student dots in the engaged quadrant, the challenged and love it area. Teacher 2, with the same students, has a variety of students, mostly in this area. And what that tells us is that if I'm going to try not to blind you, so teacher 1 up here, teacher 2 down there. Now, what this gives to us is, as we reflect on this, we can see that the constellation of dots for teacher number 2 shows that the students are telling her that they are not adequately challenged, and that is extraordinarily powerful data. We can also, because this is searchable data, we can look at individual students. This is a student, an 11th grade girl, who's a straight A student, with all of her dots here except for biology. Even though she's earning an A in biology, we know that there's a problem, that she's not being sufficiently challenged, and that allows us to remediate that work. And before students become disciplinary problems or drop out, we have information that can be extraordinarily helpful. So here is a 10th grade boy, and what we can see with all of the dots here that student is probably overwhelmed and may need some intervention. Or we may see, for this 9th grade girl, that we've already lost her. So, what do we do with all of this? Because this really requires us to think differently. about our students and how we work at them. When you're the subject of standardized testing, students are essentially treated as experimental subjects. They're like lab rats. There's one particular path to go to get to the cheese, and in this case, the cheese is the diploma. They don't get much from the high-stakes testing. It doesn't serve them particularly well. There really is no choice in what they do. We think of students differently. We think of students as partners because nobody benefits more from increasing student engagement than the students themselves. So we work with our children through a protocol we've designed to find out from them what puts them in the engaged quadrant. And I'd like to share 3 quick findings, none of which I think are anything but obvious. So first, we learn from students that when they connect with their teacher, they're more likely to be engaged. Is that a surprise to anyone? This has led us to work more directly with teachers, especially with teachers who don't seem to connect well on strategies that build bridges with students. Secondly, we learn from our students that mobility is an important factor in engagement. With that insight, we've begun to replace our clunky sled desks that are hard to move, and instead we have invested in boards and tables and chairs that roll easily and can be configured into small groups, big groups, enormous groups, in any way that seems relevant to the work that's being done. And finally, and maybe most importantly, we find that autonomy, students' ability to make key decisions about the directions of their work, is probably the greatest contributor to student engagement. I knew in my early days as a teacher that very often a student would raise a hand and ask an incredibly interesting question, and I would say, "I'm sorry, we don't have time for that, it's not on the test." If we are directed by student interest, when their interest is sincere, we can do extraordinary work. I was talking to a student last week who wanted to learn a technique about green fluorescent proteins. My last bio class was in 1972. I had no idea what he was talking about, but it seemed really cool. We connect him with teacher and then with institutions in Columbus to do advanced work in those areas. And with this insight, we've been funding our teachers to work on new pedagogies, a new way to run their classes that gives students increased ability to make decisions about the directions of their work. So you might think now about standardized testing. When you're working on standardized testing, there is no connection, no mobility, no autonomy. So, what are we doing with this work? Wellington has taken a leadership position in work with other schools. At present, we're working with a small group of independent schools throughout the Midwest who are using this tool at their own schools. But interest has come from a variety of different places. To the east, we're working with a parochial school that's using our tool in Baltimore, Maryland. And to the west, we've gotten our first public school, the school in Wichita, Kansas, who is using our tool. And what we all do is we all recognize the enormously rich data that we can glean from this kind of work. In this society where rich data is available, we can be far more ambitious as we are committed with our partners, not just to measuring engagement, but also student ambition, creativity, resilience. We believe that schools of the 21st century can highlight skills that are essential to the success of the 21st century economy, that we can measure these skills and help students grow, which gets me back to the original question from my friend, the professor at Kenyon. Schools that focus all their attention on high-stakes standardized testing are preparing students to be active members of the 1950s economy. Schools must do better than that, and educators, legislators, and lobbyists, and everyone involved in making policy have always been interested in what people like you, who do most of the hiring, want from education. This was at the heart, I think, of Governor Kasich's proposal that teachers, in order to get or keep their license, should have to shadow a local businessman to better connect education to the workplace. What the governor may have missed, though, is that if teachers come back to their classrooms and are allowed only to work towards high-stakes standardized testing by their supervisors and administrators, then what they have learned is not particularly useful. So as I close, I ask you to think about what you can do, how you can use your voice with educators, regulators, and legislators, what you want in the workforce. If you want employees who can take initiative, can frame and solve problems, who are resilient and who love a challenge, say so, and then demand to know how schools can develop these qualities in students and how schools can measure these things. It can be done. We'd love to talk with you further about these issues if you're interested, if you'd like to explore further. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Jack?
One key area that you didn't cover. I'd like to know math and science versus the humanities, the simpler subjects on this side. Where do you get bored, Brian? Where do they each fall?
What we found, okay, I'm to repeat the question if I can. So you're asking about the difference between math and science versus the humanities. We have found no correlation whatsoever by subject to whether students are engaged. Great science teacher, great math teacher can engage students every bit as much. I assume part of your question is that math and science have to be grind.
Interesting, challenging, or a grind?
Right, yeah. We find that there is no correlation by subject, which we thought is fascinating. I would have thought, as a classics major, that math and science was the stuff you had to do. Right, it doesn't work out that way. Now, we have seen within those departments some teachers in some classes that have a much higher rate of engagement than others, but not by department.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Two questions. Do you have a pamphlet or something that describes all this? And secondly, where does Montessori approach fit into what you're talking about?
Okay, two questions. The first is, do we have a pamphlet? We do have part of our website at Wellington/WEI, which stands for WellingtonEngagementIndex.org. So you can get it. You can get information about that from there. In terms of Montessori, I think Montessori much of Montessori relates well to student engagement. Students have purpose and they have significant autonomy. We have not done a study at this point to determine whether Montessori schools have very much higher rankings. I suspect they very well might. Yes.
How many of your students go directly on to college and how many into the workforce? And how accepting are college admissions offices and employers of your approach?
100% of our students go to college, and the question was what percentage of our students go to college? 100%, and then the other part of that question is, do colleges accept this approach? We have not done away with grades. We have not done away with standardized testing. All of our students take the ACT or the SAT. What we have said is that while that shows something, there are other things that are every bit and in many cases more important. So what colleges would see in our students are students who frequently have made significant commitments to areas of study that they have a passionate interest in. We believe that raises engagement, and we also find that colleges find those students to be very much more interesting. How long can you talk about a 700 on an SAT? How long can you talk about a 4 or a 5 on an AP course? How long can you talk about research that you've conducted that you find fascinating, that has taken you in directions you might not have imagined? So the colleges see in our students a mixed set of data and information, but they're very interested in this kind of work. Yes.
What potential do you see for transferring it to public schools? Because you're talking about a very different population than the Wellington population.
What potential do we see for public schools using this tool? Is that the question? We see enormous potential. I was surprised when we heard from Wichita, Kansas, that they were interested in our tool because I assumed that anything you tried to get past a teachers' union, anything that did not fit into their program would be very difficult to add. What we found when we talked to the folks in Wichita is that they have been looking for alternate measures that could balance this reliance on high-stakes testing, and that what they said was that engagement had been a focus for them for years, and they felt that this was the first time they'd had something that actually would measure that. So because there are such limitations, there seems to have been significant eagerness, at least in Wichita, to use this tool. Does that answer your question?
Dwight.
Yeah.
Dwight?
This question probably has an obvious answer, but understanding what you pointed out, what is the practical difference in a classroom at Wellington versus the quote-unquote traditional classroom? How does this apply in the classroom setting?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I think we put the three things that I talked about, connection, mobility, and autonomy, are all things that I think you would witness in our classrooms. You would see that in other, I mean, you'd see much of that in other schools as well. We don't look entirely unlike all other schools. But what you would see in terms of autonomy is that students starting really at 3 years old would start to have choices to make about areas of their study. You would see a more mobile classroom than you see in some schools. And then in all good schools, you would see significant connection between teachers and students. Wellington isn't, I'm not making the claim that that is a Wellington feature alone, so. Yes?
Class size, Wellington has a much smaller class size than the average public or other private schools.
Smaller than public schools, certainly. The average class size about 16 to 18. Not smaller than other independent schools. The question was, what is the class size at Wellington? Yes?
Two quick questions. How do the teachers feel about the use of this as an evaluation tool? And have you had a chance to give this presentation to any of our legislators?
How do the teachers feel about this particular tool, and have we had a chance to give this presentation to our legislators? Okay, the first is the teachers have been remarkably interested in this. And I will say that when we started with this, because we invented this thing, we started with the notion that we had no idea whether it would work, whether it made any sense, and would they play with us. And they were willing to, and as it developed, I think our teachers saw the value in it. We have teachers who look very carefully at their constellation of dots to try to figure out how to make their classrooms better. So the other thing is, and I mentioned this, that we fund teachers. One of the things I think is very upsetting to me is when I see that there are systems where teachers are paid by the standardized test scores of their students. Many of the issues that result in those test scores have nothing to do with teachers, and I find that a little bit shocking. We said, what would it be that we could pay teachers for that would actually have meaning and would improve the classroom? And so we've invested in this. In terms of, I have not presented to legislators at this time. I did have a long talk with a several former superintendents of public education in the state of Ohio who was too busy to see me. And when I offered to come to his office for 15 minutes, he was still too busy to see me. So, but that's our next thing. So, it's a great question. Thank you.
So now you're at the end of your presentation. In the beginning of your presentation, we talked about what you asked your kids when you came home. So if you had to reverse it now, and you had to raise your kids over, which I have young children myself,
Right.
What is the question you asked?
And this is always the question we get, which is, what is the question that we should replace how was school today? How many of you have teenagers or had teenagers? All right, here's the answer. Here's the answer. You're going to get the grunt no matter what you ask. It does seem that kids will talk to you for a while, and then they won't for a long time, and then they'll talk to you again afterwards. No, that'd be a book I'd write if I had the answer to that one. There is no answer.
Do engaged students in particular areas get to have more time in that area?
The question is, do engaged students in an area get to have more time in that area? In our school, we have developed a variety of options, particularly in the high school, where students can do independent science research or independent humanities research, often at a level beyond what some of our teachers can do, in which case we work to connect them to people, mostly in Columbus, but sometimes around the world. We do build into our schedule some time and some energy in most places for students to have some opportunity to direct their own learning. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Mike?
I will have an answer for Evan, because
Yeah.
I went to a class when my kids were in middle school to learn. Instead of saying, how was your day? And they say, fine, just change the question to, tell me about your day. Because then they can't answer yes, no, fine, whatever.
That works a lot of the time. They can still grunt at you, though. And I think it's a really good idea, particularly when your kids are in middle school, to visit them often in their school and go up to them and give them a hug and a kiss in front of their friends.
My question is,
Yes.
when we're looking for Rotary speakers, we know that we have to have both of these characteristics to have a good program. The subject has to be interesting, and the speaker has to be a good speaker. Congratulations, you get an A on both, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
But let's pretend you're a teacher and you're teaching me whatever class, and the scores from the students are terrible, and you go to the teacher and say, you know, here you are on the grid, and we're not happy with you.
Right.
And she says, well, or he says, it's my subject matter, and I'm stuck with this awful class. And then my second question is, so let's pretend the teacher just has been there 10 years and consistently gets these horrible scores, and the kids are not learning and they're not having fun. What can you do about it?
Okay, so the questions are, what happens when, first off, what happens when a teacher who might have bad dots says, it's not me, it's that group of kids, or it's not me, it's that subject? Well, one of the, and then you're going to maybe remind me with the second question. One of the things that we provide for every teacher when the teacher gets his or her constellation of dots is we also give them the overall set of dots for that grade level in all areas, and then we also give them that set of dots for that department. So I had a fascinating conversation with one of our teachers who had one great set of, actually 3 great sets of dots in this one class that had a bad set of dots. It just so happened that the bad dots were much older than the classes with the good dots, and they were remedial, not advanced, and the great dots were in advanced classes. So she said, well, remedial students, of course, are always going to have a problem. Well, I'm never going to get good dots with them. There was another teacher teaching the same class, remedial class, same population, different students, but similar population who had great dots. When you look at those two next to each other, the teacher has to say, well, maybe I have something to do with it. So being able to have that conversation is really important. We've also had other conversations. Physical education is up here. Kids are not always challenged by physical education. Is it okay for kids just to be unchallenged and love it in a PE class? I don't know. We have conversations about that. So we're able to look through this searchable data at comparative work that allows us to eliminate some of those perceived biases. And your second question was?
Just, I mean, we kind of collectively agree that my dots aren't good. I've been here year after year.
Yeah.
My dots are always bad.
Right.
I'm in a union. I get the same pay
Right.
as the best teacher in the
Right.
school, and I'm
Right.
considered the worst teacher in the school.
Right.
What can you do to improve my situation if you're just not our best teacher?
Well, one thing is we don't have unions at the Wellington School. And so the approach, that's going to be a question I'm going to ask our friends in Wichita what they do about it. If we start with the presumption that people would like to be better than they are, which is not always the case, you have a chance to do good work. And I will tell you, I have taught badly many times. I've taught well a couple of times. teaching well is a whole lot more fun than teaching badly. So in a unionized place, I don't know I don't have an answer for that question. But in our place, we work on this. The other thing that's really interesting to me is that the dots almost never are surprises to us. They're generally consistent with other things we know and have heard. One of the things that I like about the dots is that they actually give us data. So it's not we don't like you. It's this is what we're receiving. So Hugo.
Is your model copyrighted? Is it published? Is it available on the web for us to?
It is trademarked, and it is our intention someday to sell this to schools across the country for $1 billion. Because one of the things we're trying to figure out is how can you run a great school where you don't have to charge a whole lot of money to do it. So that's one of the things. And again, at Wellington, .org/WEI. There's information for you if you're interested. We'd love to work with people in schools. So, and right now we're offering this for free to most of the schools we're working with.
How do you help the teacher with bad dots?
This is a great question. How do you help people with bad? Did you say with bad dots? With bad dots. We go to the class. We try and figure out what's going on there. But what we're starting with is connection, mobility, and autonomy. And our first thing we always look at is, does the teacher have difficulty connecting with students? And then there are skills we can work on that help teachers to do that, like from time to time, listen to a student. We've had a long debate about whether you can teach people who don't connect well to connect well. I think there are certain skills you can teach. For instance, I can look you in the eye. I can look you in the eye sincerely and ask you, did I answer your question? So, we work on those skills. Yeah.
What is the extent and role of extracurricular activities? Do you measure them using the same tool?
Can you measure extracurricular activities using the same tool? We have not done that yet. I'm going to write that down, and when we get back to school, I'm going to start on that right away. We're not doing that right now, but it's a great idea. Yeah. One more. Yes, one more?
My question is, are the results shared with students and perhaps alumni in terms of alumni responding after they've graduated?
Okay, the question is, are the results shared with students and with alumni? And the answer is we are public about the gross percentages in the quadrant for the whole school. We, in fact, have said in our strategic plan to get to a particular set of numbers on the chart where when we started, we want to be under 10% in the board quadrant. We've actually hit that. We're at 7.4%, I think. We're aiming for over 60% in the engaged quadrant. So we present that material. What we don't do is we don't show a teacher or parents an individual student's dots, because we think if we did, that student would never give us honest dots again. So that's about the extent of our sharing. So a teacher can see his or her dots, but can't see which student is which student. I can, and the division, the principals can, but no one else can. Okay.
Okay. Rob, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you.
It's very wonderful. So with that, good selling, and have a great week. This meeting's adjourned.